God uses a woman. Now, again, I know I'm fishing on thin ice here, okay? I know about the CMA, and I know what the CMA teaches here. And I mention this because many people have questions about women leading and teaching in the church. But we can't cut this part out of the Bible, you know. This is a subject on which many well-meaning Christians disagree. And some of them are my very close friends, okay? But I just want to point this out that even in the Old Testament, you know, this is before Christ died. Paul writes in the New Testament, so that there's neither male and female, but we're all one, for the Holy Spirit is poured out on men and women alike. But you see here, even in the Old Testament, Deborah was the highest leader in Israel. And although she's married, it was she, not her husband, that's chosen by God to be the leader of His people. In fact, if you read about her husband as a part of Israel, you know, people think, well, what about him? Well, the Bible, it doesn't really say that this guy is kind of a wimpy guy, this Lapidoth. We don't get that impression, because a lot of people think, well, maybe her husband was wimpy and that's why she had to do it. It doesn't say that he was spiritually apathetic, you know, so God installed her to shame the men. He just chooses Deborah. That's who God chooses to lead His people. So, you'll see here the respect that she commands. Look at verse 8. This is a remarkable story. She calls the commander-in-chief of Israel's forces, a guy named Barak, and she gives him an order to march against Sisera, against the enemy. Look at verse 8. Barak said to her, if you will go with me, okay, now he's saying this to a woman, if you'll go with me, I'll go, but if you don't go with me, I won't go. So this guy is the commander-in-chief. This guy is the big general. And he won't go to battle unless a woman goes with him. And it's kind of counter to all the stereotypes in that day, isn't it? Reminds me of a story, and again, this actually happened, okay? This is the Mattel factory, and somebody mixed up the voice boxes that were supposed to go into the Barbie dolls with the G.I. Joe dolls. Now again, I'm not making this up. This actually happened. It traumatized kids. Because they got the wrong toy. Because they would pull the string on Barbie's back and it'd say, let's move out. Show me some guts. And little boys thought, you know what, you know? And little boys would pull the cord on G.I. Joe and he'd say, let's go shopping. Kids were traumatized all over America. Reversal of stereotypes. They say traumatizing for a lot of kids. But see, that's what's going on in this text. The general says, I'm not going to battle unless you, Deborah, a woman, go with me. And she goes and it all works out. There's a battle. And again, God is at work to deliver His people. But the cycle is still intact. And He sends a storm and the river floods and the wheels, because of the chariots that Sisera is so proud of, so reliant on, they get stuck. Because very unexpectedly there's a storm and Israel is saved. Now Sisera, the general, runs out of a tent to a Kenite woman whose name is Jael. And her husband is friends with Sisera, but the Kenites generally were allies, we read, of Israel. And she was sympathetic towards Israel. So Sisera goes into Jael's tent, because nobody in Near Ancient East, you know, would look for a man in a tent of another woman, the guy's wife, you know. So he figures he's safe in there. Now, I know that Jael is not a judge, but there's something we can learn from this, and I want you to get this in your notes, okay? This is from Jael. Sometimes victory comes in unexpected ways. Sometimes victory comes in unexpected ways. God doesn't do things exactly like we think He's always going to do them. But He's God and He's ruler of all, and sometimes that victory, even though Jael is not a judge, she's a female, God still uses her. Look at Judges 4:18. Jael went out to meet Sisera and said to him, come, my lord, come right in. Don't be afraid. So he entered her tent and she put a covering over him. I'm thirsty, he said. Please give me some water. She opened a skin of milk and gave him a drink and covered him up. Stand in the doorway of the tent, he told her. If someone comes by and asks you, is someone here? Say no. Now, again, this is an unbelievable story. Skip down to verse 21. But Jael, Heber's wife, picked up a tent peg and a hammer and went quietly to him while he lay fast asleep, exhausted. She drove the peg through his temple into the ground, and he died. Now, you have any idea how much strength it takes to drive a peg all the way through somebody's head to the ground? I don't know, but Jael is not a chick you want to mess with, okay? She had it going on, and God used her. But again, it's a very violent story, but it's a cycle. And Israel is delivered from oppression again. The cycle continues. Now in chapter 5, Deborah writes this ancient hymn of worship, which means not only was she a judge and she was also a prophet, she's also one of the inspired authors of a chapter of the Bible. And God, He delivers His people. And you think, finally maybe these people have learned their lesson. Maybe. Not so much. Go to 6 verse 1. Again, the Israelites did evil in the eyes of the Lord. Now, you'd think by now God's patience would be getting a little thin with these guys. And it says, for 7 years He gave them into the hands of the Midianites. Because the power of Midian was so oppressive, the Israelites prepared shelters for themselves in mountain clefts, caves, and strongholds. Whenever the Israelites planted their crops, the Midianites, Amalekites, and other eastern people, they invaded the country. They camped on the land and ruined the crops all the way to Gaza, and did not spare a living thing for Israel, neither sheep nor cattle nor donkeys. Now look at this level of oppression here, okay? They came up with their livestock and their tents like swarms of locusts. It was impossible to count them or their camels. They invaded the land to ravage it. Midian was so impoverished, the Israelites they cried out to the Lord for help. So we have trouble, and here comes help. And this cycle continues to go. And one more time, God responds. And He comes up with one of the most unlikely characters in Israel. This guy named Gideon. Now, you have to understand here to appreciate the story that Gideon, he fights fear and he fights self-doubt all of his life. And I was trying to think of someone that we could maybe picture in our head to think about who is Gideon like. And if you remember the old Andy Griffith show, Gideon has got to be this Barney Fife, okay? This has got to be Gideon. He's got to be Barney Fife, you know? And if we read this story, if you just picture Barney Fife as we talk about Gideon, you get this sense of level of anxiety and fear that Gideon is dealing with here. Look at verse 11. The angel of the Lord came and sat down under the oak of the Orpha that belonged to Joash the Abiezrite, where his son Gideon was threshing wheat in a winepress. Now, this is a small detail here. You have to think about this, okay? Usually wheat would be threshed on level ground so the wind wouldn't blow the chaff away. But we have Gideon that's doing it in a winepress, which was a pit that was hollowed out in the stony ground. And he's doing this because he's scared to death. He wants to hide from the Midianites, and that's where we first find him. He's hiding from the Midianites. He's threshing wheat in a winepress to keep from the Midianites. It says, when the angel of the Lord appeared to Gideon and said, the Lord is with you, mighty warrior. And you kind of get this idea that he's thinking, you're talking to the deputy. You need to find my Sheriff Andy. You know, you're talking to the wrong guy here. Do you know who you're talking to? This is what Gideon says. But sir, Gideon replied, if the Lord is with us, why has all this happened to us? Where are all the wonders that our parents told us about when they said, did not the Lord bring us out of Egypt? But now the Lord has abandoned us and put us into the hands of Midian. The Lord turned to him and said, go in the strength you have and save Israel out of Midian's hand. Am I not sending you? But Lord, Gideon asked, how can I save Israel? My clan is the weakest in Manasseh, and I am the least in my family. The Lord answered, I will be with you, and you will strike down all the Midianites together. Now, Gideon, he can't believe this. He can't believe it. He asked, I have to have a sign. You have to send some kind of sign, and God sends a miraculous fire to consume his sacrifice. And God tells Gideon, go, and you need to tear down your father's idols to Baal and build an altar to God. You have to do this. You know, the God of Israel. You have to sacrifice. But look here at Judges 6:27. So Gideon took 10 of his servants and did as the Lord told him. But because he was afraid of his family, again, because he was afraid of his family and the townspeople, he did it at night rather than doing it at daytime. This is amazing. But God protects Gideon, and he succeeds. And now it's time to do battle with the Midianites that God has called him to do. And you'd think that now that Gideon's got enough faith, but he doesn't. In verse 36, it's where Gideon lays out a fleece. And again, this has become quite popular with a lot of Christians. You know, setting out a fleece. It's a common thing in our day, and it's often done in churches by Christians. But I want you to notice in the Bible, this is not really a positive thing that we find Gideon doing. Look at verse 36. Gideon said to God, "If you will save Israel by my hand as you have promised." Now, did you notice what he says? Because hasn't God already promised this? But Gideon says, "If you'll do what you promised to do, make this fleece wet with dew and the ground dry." And you see, the fleece is not an expression of trust. This is not an expression of faith. What we have here is Gideon being Barney Fife. It's an expression of weakness. It's an expression of immaturity on Gideon's part. And I mention this because people misuse this fleece idea and they get very superstitious in the way that they interact with God all the time. One of my favorite comedians, Ken Davis, tells a story about driving to the bakery one time, and he said a little prayer. He says, "Okay, God, if there is a parking spot available right in front of the bakery, that means you want me stopped for a donut." He said, "I had to drive around the bakery 5 times before there was finally... But it was God's will because there was one open, you know." You see, Christians, it's so easy for us to manipulate the fleece deal any way we want to. So we have to be very careful with that. Now, the way to learn God's will is by discernment. By having your mind immersed in the Bible. By prayer. By learning to listen to God. By getting corporate guidance. By having wise and trusted brothers and sisters in Christ. And by developing wisdom. You see, this fleece deal is about immaturity. That's what it's about. But as is so often the case, God's gracious with Gideon. He loves him and he wants to use him. So he does this fleece deal twice, and that doesn't mean that it's a precedent. God is gracious. And finally we find that Gideon is ready. And in Judges chapter 7, they go to war against the Midianites. And Gideon, he sends out the call to several nearby tribes. And most of the judges, by the way, they often didn't deal in actions that involved the whole country. Very often it was just localized. And the judges probably overlapped with each other's terms. But Gideon, what he does is he calls out people from several tribes to join him. And he's kind of successful. You know, he's gained about 32,000 soldiers. But the only problem is, we find out in chapter 8, he's got 32,000 soldiers. The Midianites have 135,000 soldiers. So 32,000 over here and 135,000 over there. So it's kind of like I'm not a math genius, but like a 4-to-1 kind of account. So God comes to Gideon and says, "Hey, Gideon, enemy's got 135,000 troops. You only got 32,000. Hey, Gideon, you got a numbers problem." Gideon says, "God, I was getting a little worried there, you know. I was afraid you weren't going to make it down here and help out. I only got 32,000. God says, "No, Gideon, I wouldn't do that. You got too many. Send some home. Anybody that says they're afraid." Now, again, Gideon's not happy about this, so he has to say the troops. And again, I imagine he said it in a way that would try to keep him from leaving in shame. He probably said something like, "Now, if any of you are afraid of going into battle with the Midianites, you know, you can feel free to just go ahead and go home, okay?" 22,000 men went home, okay? And again, that's an indication morale was not real high. You know, people aren't real excited about going into war with Barney Fife as the chief here. But there's 10,000 soldiers left. So again, being a mathematician, I am not. That basically comes down to 13-to-1 now. So God comes to Gideon. "Hey, Gideon, you got a numbers problem." Gideon says, "That's okay, God. I don't need your help anymore." Because he knew what direction this was going. And God says, "No, Gideon, let's take this one more round." So he tells Gideon, "Have everybody go to the riverbank and drink, and send home everybody who kneels down and drinks from their